The reduction in the consumption of cigarettes is probably the most significant reduction in drug use and most significant gain in public health of all the drugs we deal with in our society, legal or illegal. Did we do it with prohibitionist laws? No. We did it with education and taxation and regulation and social opprobrium. We didn't need a criminal prohibition. Now the World Health Organization is designing an international convention to try to have a tough regulatory approach with respect to tobacco all around the world. Should we go to tobacco prohibition? Should we actually criminalize it? Just to drive out the rest of those ones who just didn't get the message so far. What would happen? What would happen? I think we could reduce the number of cigarette smokers even further through tobacco prohibition. I think we could reduce the number of people dying of cancer, lung cancer, through tobacco prohibition. I think that would be a positive thing. And what else would happen? Would millions of people still insist on smoking tobacco? Oh, yes. Would new criminal gangs emerge to supply those tobacco? Yes, they would. Would the new tobacco traficantes emerge and the Al Capones emerge? Oh, yes, they would too. Would Afghanistan and Colombia shift their production? You bet they would. Would your prisons fill up with tobacco law violators? Would the Americans create a new law enforcement agency, the TEA, Tobacco Enforcement Administration, sending its agents all around the world to train foreign peoples about the dangers of tobacco? And would the nature of tobacco and cigarette consumption be transformed? Would people begin to talk and think about consuming tobacco in new ways? Would the consumption of tobacco become a little more like the consumption of crack? You know, that smell, that aroma can give you away. Let's change it so it's more discreetly consumed. You know, smoking cigarettes is like taking little tiny crack hits, except much more subtle. That's why it weaves its way in. But maybe now we'd really be taking it in much, remember, the dose is the poison. There are parts of Latin America, you know, where shamanic rituals include taking tobacco in incredibly powerful forms that cause massive hallucinations. That same stuff you smoke in the, or once smoked in the cigarettes is the same stuff that those Indians are using to see God and lots else. Same drug, different form, different context, different set and setting, different potency. We could transform the nature of the drug. We could transform it to make it more dangerous and more deadly. Hey, quite frankly, how many of you love that cup of coffee? Just raise your hand, please. How many of you love that cup of coffee? Okay. Well, you know what? It's banned tomorrow. Because the doctors have figured out it does crappy things to your heart and your urinary tract, and society would be better off without it. And besides, the people who produce tea are getting more politically powerful. So we are going to ban coffee right now. Well, what would happen? Well, many of you would switch. I don't need coffee that much. I'll switch to tea or something else, or maybe those little high-powered drinks they have, Red Bull or whatever you call them in your country, right? But millions would continue, and the nature of coffee consumption would be transformed. People would start to inject caffeine. Ooh. It would be a whole new experience, black markets once again. Do you see the point I'm trying to drive at here? I actually think there were pivotal moments in our history where, for various reasons, often having to do with race and prejudice, your first anti-opium laws were oftentimes motivated by anti-Chinese sentiment, as was also true in other parts of the Commonwealth and in my country. First anti-opium laws in my country against the Chinese in Nevada and California. First anti-cocaine laws against the blacks in the South 100 years ago. The first anti-cannabis laws against Mexicans and Mexican Americans in the Midwest in the teens and the 20s. Always a racial origin, not the only factor but driving it. Why? Because the drug was more dangerous? No, it was because of who used it, because of the color of their skin, because of their youth, because of what have you, because they were taking the good jobs from the good white people. Always also the playing by the propagandist on fears for our women and children. If those Chinamen, those black men, those Negroes, those Latinos take those drugs, well, they'll forget their place and they will rape and seduce our women and lure our children. Always. In fact, if you read the literature of the alcohol temperance warriors in the 1890s, 1900s and teens and 20s, what you see is using exactly the same language verbatim as you see in your daily tabloids today or our tabloids today about methamphetamine, ecstasy, and heroin. Exactly the same language. And the same notions that nobody can use it responsibly. Anybody who touches it is on a road to hell and damnation and what have you. These laws can change. They are not constant. They are not constant. And I think that really the challenge in some respects, the challenge is not just, none of this is, for most of you, this is not a priority in your life the way it is in mine and a few others, but understanding this history and looking at this cross-culturally and in different ways, understanding what we carry within ourselves and our fears. I think at my own personal evolution in thinking about how I thought about homosexuality from when I was 12 years old, and it was, oh my God, to now, gay, straight, more or less the moral equivalent of left-handed or right-handed. Maybe not quite, and maybe that's because of the prejudices I still retain within myself. But understanding the extent to which the laws we use transform the substances and the people who are involved with them. There are some people involved in that drug world who are just straight-out bums. And drugs is just incidental to their existence, and they thrive off its black market nature, and one day they're going to go to prison, whether it's for drugs or for something else. But too many people don't want to be part of that world. Too many people want to emerge to something else. Too many people want to be normal on some level. Somehow this notion, the UN proclaims it, the US proclaims it, a drug-free society, we can do it. So said the UN in 1998. Congress, my Congress 20 years ago, passed a resolution declaring that America would be drug-free by 1995. But what's that about? There's never been a drug-free society in human history. The possible exception of the Eskimos, because they couldn't grow anything. But this notion that somehow this belief that we all emerge from our mother's wombs as perfectly balanced chemical creatures. And if only we could all go through our life without ever needing these things. And yet, sad to say, that's not the way it is. We don't all emerge as perfectly balanced chemical creatures. Some of us are born with, maybe it's a deficit of endorphins, of the body's natural opioids, which is what makes us more attracted to those substances. Why is it? There are a few drugs when they first take it, they say, my God, that's the first time I ever felt normal. I've heard that most said with respect to two drugs, Prozac and heroin. Why do a lot of people just take an opiate, they throw up, they don't want to touch it, and other people, it's like all of a sudden they feel normal for the first time. Pharmaceutical companies are making new things, and we're not going to have a ban on those things. Forget their political powers, because they're creating products that we all need and want. Maybe the solution here is the domestication of psychoactive substances. It's the learning how to live with these plants and chemicals in such a way that they cause the least possible harm and the greatest possible good. And that is a challenge we address in our own individual lives. It is a challenge we deal with our own family lives when we decide whether or not we or somebody we love should go on antidepressants, or whether kids should go on stimulants and Ritalin drugs, or whether or not as we grow older we're going to use Viagra and sexual enhancers, or whether all of these things, these are the decisions we make by struggling and learning. Not by having the police in our bedroom or the police in our room. And the same views, the same attitudes we want to bring in thinking about how we deal with ourselves and our loved ones, in dealing with drugs, booze, and illicits and pharmaceuticals, and wanting that to be a decision made among ourselves with adequate and accurate information, and with doctors' knowledgeable advice, and not with law enforcement lurking at the door. Can we open our hearts and our minds and extend that to the people on the streets who we don't want to talk with and we don't want to look at, and God forbid one of our loved ones should ever land up like them? There's wonderful and brave and courageous people working for a pittance trying to deal with those people. And when they deal with those people, they find out just what we find dealing with everybody else, that some of them are assholes and some of them are really decent people just trying to get it together. And that it's our prejudice holding them back. I wish my country, I'm a proud American, I'm quite a patriot in many respects, I wish my country were not leading a policy so draconian, so terrible. Tonight, in the United States of America, almost 500,000 people are going to spend the night behind bars for violating a drug law. We lock up more people in my country for a drug law violation than all of Western Europe locks up for everything. And you have 100 million more people than we do. When Tony Blair, If he wants to follow Bush down certain roads, that's your problem. He wants to follow Bush down roads in the drug policy area, which he is doing now, it's also your problem. When he thinks that criminalization and criminal justice, when he thinks that the only way to deal with drug addiction is to force people through coercive court systems and throw them back behind bars if they test dirty, hand in dirty urines, you are following the American model, and you are following an American model that leads the world, that breaks the record in democratic human history in the per capita incarceration rate of our fellow citizens. Do not follow in the American footsteps. We are not the ones leading the way.